I want to unpack, or rather point out something that's very important as that I thought about as you were talking, right? And this is important for everybody who's in the comments. This is important for everyone. I've seen some comments who like people have appreciated this discussion and really like the discussion. And I think that there are obviously a number of different layers to our conversation. But the one thing I want to point out that's like of critical importance is we have to learn how to have this type of honest and uncomfortable dialogue with one another
Yeah.
without it being so separating that we end up severing possible relationships and alliances and abilities to work together in the future. We have to be able to do that. And it doesn't mean that we're always going to agree. We have to learn how to agree or disagree without being disagreeable, as it sounds. And for as simple as a mandate as that is, in 2020, it's very complicated for us to do for some reason. But in the end, the only people who win are white supremacists. Like
That's
white supremacy wins when we are not able to have these conversations in a reasoned way. Like we don't agree on everything, and we're not going to agree on everything. But that's where nuance comes into play. That's where I was talking about that 10 out of 10. So above everything else, obviously there are a lot of cultural takeaways from today's discussion that I hope people will continue to dig into and engage. But above everything else, please recognize the importance of being able to have reasoned and objective and honest conversation that doesn't result in a whole bunch of like you over there and me over here, because we end up doing the oppressor's work for us in that regard. I wanted to talk really, really quickly about the significance of like language,
yeah.
because you and I talked about that a little bit in different ways, and you just sort of hinted on it in terms of like, the Spanish that I speak is Castellano, and that's how I learned Spanish because I learned it in grade school, and we've talked about the different dialects and the different languages that people speak across different colonized nations. But I just find that so interesting that is such a powerfully divisive tool, perhaps more so than skin culture, in terms of keeping us within the diaspora separated.
Yep.
Like it's cliche and almost sort of basic to say like, yo, we're not talking the same language. But I can think of, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. I can think of sort of no greater tool to
Yeah.
either bind or disconnect someone from their culture than actually taking their language. I think when I think about what like colonization did in that regard with respect to like Hispaniola and some people speaking French and some people speaking Creole and some people speaking Spanish, and then English being thrown throughout the diaspora and all of the above, I'm like, man, what a mind fuck. Like,
Yeah.
what a complete mind fuck.
Yeah. And when you just talk about Haitian people, right? Some people will will point out, oh, they don't speak French, they speak Creole. Like that's not real French, right? They do that to Puerto Ricans with their Spanish, right? They're like, oh, Puerto Ricans don't speak real Spanish. They say ajo because we're using our African words and
I say rice, just rice.
that right. And because that is our Taino in us, right? And you're right about that. When I went to St. Martin, people would be like, oh no, that's the Dutch side. Oh no, that's the French side, as if that one is better than the other. And it's like you looking at people who look like you, right? And that's what I do. Like when I went to Palestine, when I went to Africa, not to flex, but thankful for comedy, I've been able to travel the world, and I always seek my people out. Everywhere I go, people are like, why you? When I went to New Orleans, the first thing I went to was the Magnolias. I was like, I always go look for my people everywhere I go, and I'm so fascinated at the attitude that we have towards each other, depending on how we speak. And Puerto Ricans will do it with Puerto Ricans in New York and say, oh, those are New York Ricans. They don't even know how to speak Spanish. And Dominicans do it with Dominicans. Mexicans do it here with they call you a güero or a gringo because you trying to be white because you in America. And yes, I think language, and someone pointed out here as well, religion have been very big tools in separating us from our true identities. And so, yes, I agree with you.
And I think, I think that is
Like,
part.
you even think you speak better Spanish than me. You like, I speak Castilian Spanish, and I'm like, I speak Puerto Rican Spanish. Lady,
I think, and sort of circling back, right? This is an important conversation because it is a need to open the door to a greater understanding. And I think that a large part of what happens is people look at American-born Blacks specifically, and they don't necessarily get why the conversation is as tense as it is sometimes. Because they're like, yo, we all face white supremacy and we all face white oppression and we all face systemic inequity. And they feel like, yo, we all immigrants, and they treat immigrants a certain way and they discriminate. And the thing that I have to point out to people more often than not is like, I appreciate what you're coming from. I appreciate what you're saying. I appreciate the challenges associated with your experiences, but I need you to understand, if not acknowledge, that we are not the same, and that I'm not an immigrant. I didn't choose to come here. My ancestors didn't choose to come here. It's not a matter of comparison in the sense of being the oppression Olympics. That's not the point. The point is, a lot of times what happens is our experience specifically within that diaspora and that conversation gets lumped in a way that sort of gets blended in and watered down, and our voices get lost. And that's where we get pissed off. That's the anger and the angst and the response and the vitriol that you're seeing from a large number of people in our community. As you've already said, we're not a monolith. And so I don't profess to speak, I barely profess to speak for myself, let alone my entire community. I don't speak for my entire community, but I will say that among a large part, I don't give a fuck what Ben Carson said. We don't consider ourselves to be immigrants. And when I say we, I'm talking about American-born Black people, right? And so I think that understanding and appreciating and giving voice to that type of difference, right? Because even for you, and for many of the people who are on here, if you're an immigrant, more than likely, you can tie yourself culturally to somewhere else other than America. Right. But as a person who was Black in America, who was a descendant of slavery, my shit only goes back but so far. And that's a different mind fuck to deal with altogether. So when I'm sort of processing that and operating in that space, it's almost insulting for somebody else to be like, I don't fuck with y'all because that, y'all, I'm better than. It's like, word? That word? You know what I'm saying? So I think that is, or conversely, right, to sit at the table and start talking about our respective issues and where we can work with each other, and just be told, oh nah, we just all the same, or all our shit is alike in terms of experience.
Right.
I think that part, is the part where conversations like these are very, very important to understand, because being enslaved in the sense of chattel slavery and its history in America, and being colonized, they definitely have similarities, but they're also different, because there's a cultural disconnect that, I have to work infinitely harder to try to reconnect, that someone who immigrated here from another place and can trace their ancestral lineage, back several generations, doesn't have to deal with. And that matters. That does matter.
No, I totally respect that, and I think it's important to be able to make those distinctions. And we don't have to have the oppression Olympics, as they say, to be able to respect that the journeys are different. And yes, we do have, I do know that my grandmother's grandmother was a slave. And I do know, I can trace back to where people here in America cannot. But what I think the more important thing that I want people to walk away from is that it is possible to have conversations that are uncomfortable without us having to demonize one another. And the other thing that I wanted to say is, because I've been called a sellout in the last couple of weeks several times from different groups, but the one that's the recent one was because I voted. and they were like, both sides are the same. You would sell out. You be talking all that shit about how you down for the people, but you voting for Biden. Biden is a pedophile, the crime bill. And what I wanted to say was that I think it's important that you are just as important as ADOS is as important as the Afro Latino movement is as important, so that we could dismantle this. And nobody is going to be exactly the same, and everybody has their own methodology. But we have to be able to respect one another and stop throwing each other out the house, because it's getting lonely in this bitch.